January 29th, 1944. 0800 hours. North of the Marshalls, somewhere above a slate blue Pacific that looked calm enough to lie to a man about what lived under it. The carrier's wake drew a straight white sentence across the water, and the morning brief had been one of those careful speeches full of words that tried not to say, "This could go badly," while everyone in the ready room heard nothing else. On the flight deck, a row of F6F-3 Hellcats crouched with chocks in, blue-grey flanks shining with salt mist and handprints. They were heavier than they looked, thicker than the magazine photographs made them seem, with stubby, purposeful lines like a boxer's shoulders under a flight jacket. A young plane captain patted a cowl and whispered something he'd never admit to later. In the cockpit of the second plane in the starboard row sat a pilot who had been told not to do the thing he had come to believe would keep them alive. He looked at the altimeter, then at a pencil line he'd scratched on the panel the night before, and decided he'd do it anyway. His name did not make it into history books the way aces' names do. Call him Mason Hale, because he could have been any of the men who were old enough to distrust luck and young enough to keep flying after luck left the room. He had come up in Wildcats and learned the thatch weave as if it were a catechism, two planes saving one another by turning a Zero's obsession with angles into a trap. But the Wildcats lesson had also taught him a second, quieter thing. The man who chooses when the merge happens owns the fight. The Hellcat was not a knife fighter. It was a hammer you dropped from a roof. The manuals told him the safe dive profiles, the conservative entry speeds, the pull-out envelopes that kept a man's wings bolted to his life. Mason kept a second set of numbers in his head, learned from test hops, and a near-death he never described fully. Those numbers lived in the thin strip of air between the airplane's official limits and its secret tolerance, where compressibility whispered at the control surfaces and the Pratt & Whitney R2 800 up front turned fuel into a kind of law. The briefing called for a fighter sweep to blind whatever the enemy had left ahead of the day's strikes. Scouts had seen specs yesterday that meant combat air patrols over a string of atolls whose names would matter to history only because men died there. The pattern was familiar now. Zeros rising in tidy 2s and 4s, trying to force a turning fight the way they had since 1942, leaning on lightness and the blue-white flash of 20mm cannon. Mason's squadron leader wanted altitude discipline, clean radio calls, no wandering. He also wanted his men back, which was why he delivered the last part of the brief with the flat tone of someone who knows exactly how much a rule is worth. Do not exceed the recommended dive profile. Do not enter a terminal dive below 20,000 feet. If you're being bounced, use the weave and keep your energy. Mason nodded with the others. Pilots nodded. It was what pilots did. Then they walked into wind. A Hellcat taxiing forward always looked like it knew something a man on deck did not. The big R2800 shook the airplane at idle like a heart shivering in a chest, and when the throttle went forward, the airplane seemed to shrug off weight it had been pretending to carry. The launch officer dropped his hand. The catapult yanked the airplane as if giving it advice too fast to hear, and the carrier fell away behind the wing. Mason cleaned up gear and flaps and climbed with the formation into a morning that had the taste of sun-baked salt and gasoline. He watched the step climb unfold, Hellcats up at 24,000 in a cover slice, his division at 20,000, and a lower screen at 12,000 set to turn back anything that leaked through. The radio clicked with call signs, and then fell into that tight quiet that everyone heard before first contact. The quiet of men in loud machines trying to listen to the shape of danger. The enemy came in two waves, as if someone had taught choreography to an airfield. 4 zeros from sunward in a high, draggy arc, and a second 4 from a lower quarter, hoping the first would pull American eyes uphill. Mason saw them, because the ocean told him. Small shadows on a big mirror, fast dots that made the horizon look like it had a pulse. His leader called Angels 20, tally 4 high, 4 low, maintain energy, and the formation began to slide into the braced stance of a fist about to land. Mason did the math the way he'd taught himself since the marshals showed their teeth. If the top 4 committed to a down-angle chase and the bottom 4 tried to drag them into a turn, the space in between would be a melt zone where indecision killed you. The manual would have sent him into a measured, conservative pushover. Mason made his stick heavy. The clue lived in the Hellcat's bones. The airplane could carry speed the way a high cliff carries falling water. It could turn altitude into momentum and then into cruelty. The Zero was light and agile at low speeds, lethal in a flat turn, a surgeon's tool in the hands of men who had been practicing the cut for years. But at speed, it had ghosts in its structure, ailerons that hardened, control surfaces that asked questions where the pilot needed answers, a lack of armor and self-sealing tanks that turned a hit into a flare. The Hellcat's weight and wing let it ride the front edge of compressibility a little longer, without tumbling into irrecoverable nonsense. Mason had learned you could take it down steeper, longer, harder than the tech order liked, if you set the airplane up for it. Prop to course pitch, throttle staged, trim tucked to hair against the dive, and your hand on the throttle not like a lover, but like a brake handle in a runaway trolley, ready to move but not to panic. The reckless part only looked like recklessness from the bleachers. He broke. It wasn't pretty. A pretty break is a photograph in a coffee table book. This one was a shoulder dropped into the opening. The Hellcat rolled onto a wing and pushed over, slipped forward on a line that only made sense if you knew the geometry in Mason's head. And the altimeter began to peel numbers as if someone had opened a drain. The 4 zeros from above committed in the same second, predators seeing prey, and followed the leading elements of the American formation into a chase that should have ended in a classic merge. 2 lines crossing, everyone jinking, the air filling with pieces. Mason's dive didn't give them the merge they wanted. He sent his airplane into the space below, the expected point of contact, a long bow shot where bashful men stay away. He wasn't bashful. He wasn't aiming at an airplane so much as at where an airplane would be after it made the decision he needed it to make. The first Zero obliged. It rolled to follow a high American and overshot just enough that its belly flashed white for a heartbeat. Mason let the Pipper kick across that belly on a diagonal and gave the 6.5 Zeros the clean, 1-second burst he'd promised himself. There's a sound a Hellcat makes when the battery is working together. Less a roar than a tearing sound chewed by a metronome. The Zero flinched, and then opened like a clay pot. The hit was not dramatic in the way newsreels wanted. It was ugly and quick and explicit. A smear of orange flickered in the wing root, and then the airplane simply was not anyone's problem anymore. Mason flattened the dive a sliver, let the speed run past a number he had been warned not to admire, and picked up the second Zero through his canopy with a glance. Not a search. He didn't try to turn with it. He let gravity write the sentence for him and fired when the angles made the answer obvious. Above him, the rest of the division had accepted the change in tempo because energy has a way of convincing the undecided. The leader's voice on the radio was flat with effort and something like approval. 2 down, maintain, maintain. 4 American planes that had begun to think about a weave instead punched straight through the top of the incoming and let the lower 4 Zeros commit to their trap. The lower element did what they'd been doing since the Coral Sea. They tried to force the Hellcats to tighten into a Luftbree and bleed their own speed away. The answer was the same answer Mason had been writing in his head since dawn. Don't tighten, don't plead, don't get cheap. Dive past the comfort point, hold your discipline, turn altitude into speed, and speed into safety, and safety into a firing solution that feels less like a duel and more like a physics experiment with witnesses. There were 2 bad seconds that would have ended the morning and turned men into names for their friends to carry. Mason came off his second run, hot and a third zero, clever, stubborn, climbed into his blind quadrant, and began the carve that ends in cannon shells sewing through a cockpit. You can hear when a man is spending the last coins in his account. The radio breathed out, "Check 6, in the voice of someone who had already done the math and didn't like the answer. Mason could have tried to jink. The jink would have given the zero the turn fight it wanted. He did the impolite thing instead. He pushed the nose farther down. Every nerve in his arms asked him to pull. He didn't. The altimeter spun and the control stick came back against a quieting airplane as the air thickened and flexed across the wing. And now the Zero's pilot had to decide how much courage cost at that speed. Mason knew the number. The other man decided not to pay it. He broke off a degree, and a degree was enough. The 50s did the kind of arithmetic fire does to thin metal, and the Zero lost a piece it needed to remain a noun. They climbed out past 12,000 in a loose arc, the division breathing in the way men do after someone almost became a page in a notebook. The radio went from clipped to almost light as kills were called and positions reset. They would fight twice more that morning and 3 times the next day. And each time Mason would push the dive profile a hair harder than the orders suggested. And each time the returns would be the same. No merges on the enemy's terms, no pretty turning fights, no chances given back once taken. In the ready room that afternoon, an operations officer with a pencil behind his ear tapped the board and said the things men say when they need to write cause and effect into official language. Then he walked over to Mason and said it plainly. "Don't teach them that dive until I tell you to," which was another way of saying, "I know it works, but I need to keep the number of funerals low while we teach it properly." The shipboard engineers were already doing their own version of Mason's math. The Hellcat's design had been a wager Grumman made with the war. Build a fighter that a kid could land on a carrier at night in rain. Build it forgiving. Build it thick. Trade glamour for return to deck probability. That wager paid in ways that didn't fit poster copy. Self-sealing tanks meant small fires stayed small. Cockpit armor meant shell splinters stopped writing. The wing structure handled dives that would have made a Wildcat pucker. The R2800 could stay lit, even when fragments had chewed a cowl into lace, and the Hellcat's wide tracking gear let the pilot bring it home when the deck pitched like a bad thought. Industrial redundancy hid under the paint. Standard bolts, access panels where a mechanic's hands lived, a parts commonality that meant a damaged Hellcat could be turned into a flyable Hellcat with a bosun's locker and a careful afternoon. The unapproved dive plan that had reckless in its nickname wasn't a dare to physics. It was a thank you note to engineering. Word spread the way doctrine always spreads at sea, through stories before memos. A pilot who landed with paint scorched off his wing roots told a man in the chow line that he'd taken the Hellcat down, past the edge of the numbers, and the airplane had shrugged as if daring him to try worse. A squadron gunnery officer sketched an energy profile on the back of a maintenance tag and wrote, "Enter at 28, hold 36, ease to 24, pull clean, no brake turns," as if he were writing a recipe. The air group commander watched gun camera film of Zeros turning into fire because they had been taught by a war 10,000 miles long to trust a flat circle more than a steep line. He wrote a cautious paragraph for the daily doctrine sheet. High side slashing attack authorized at discretion. Avoid flat engagements. Maintain energy. Avoid negative G. Unload below 12. An instructor from the training carrier read it and made a note to add a half day of dive profiles to the syllabus, once he found an afternoon and some spare fuel. The change did not live only in cockpits. Down on the hangar deck, armourers laid belts with the care tailors give to wedding dresses. The mix was a practiced liturgy, API, AP, APT, API, the tracer round rare enough to warn without making the gunner shoot only at light. Men seated links with their thumbs until the skin on the pads grew hard and glossy. They checked headspace and timing with gauges that felt like talismans. If a burst was to be short and surgical, the gun had to be honest, and honesty is maintenance done by men who will never be on the mission report, but who write their initials on history in grease pencil. Plane captains ran their hands along wing roots feeling for that slight ripple that meant a pullout had asked a little too much of a spar. Hydraulics men bled lines and listened to actuators like doctors listening for murmurs. The Hellcat was a machine that needed care in big, obvious ways, and in small ones you only learned by staying late. Radio men learned to make the dive plan sing. The new trick was to vector with a patience that felt like laziness and was actually art. Angels 2-4, Bandit sunward, 20 miles, hold altitude, hold, now. The word now brought a kill. The word now saved lives. The radar in the CIC, down and aft of the island, became a metronome for a song pilots had been humming alone. Mason walked down there once between cycles and watched strangers in headphones move grease pencil blips across a plexiglass board. A petty officer with a cigarette stuck to his lip, without any help at all, used a ruler to draw a line that would turn into a dive 60 seconds later. Mason thought, not for the first time, that the war's brain lived below the waterline. The next crucible came not over anonymous atolls, but on a day when the ocean filled with airplanes, June 19th, 1944, and the battle got a nickname so eager and ugly, it felt like a newspaperman's grin. The enemy launched in tidal sets. The fleet's CAP had altitude and discipline, and an agreed-upon sin. Do not squander speed in a turn that feels brave and announces your funeral. The dive plan turned into a reflex you could see in gun camera film, the horizon tilting, the pipper drifting with the steadiness of a heartbeat, the bursts clipped short, the recovery happening before the pilot asked for a medal. Zeros tried ladder climbs and met slashing attacks coming down like roof tiles in a windstorm. A few got through and cut holes in the sky where American airplanes should have been. Many didn't. The ready room that night smelled like coffee and salt, and a strain of laughter that sounded like a hinge, trying not to rust. The plan had its own predators. Compressibility lived like a rumor below the altitudes men liked to admit. In a dive too long, the elevator stopped feeling like a lever and started feeling like a coat rack bolted to stone. Mason lost a friend to that invisible hand on a day of flat light. In the debrief, the ops officer didn't talk about heroism. He talked about numbers. He drew a curve that bent when the air bent and made everyone look at the point on the curve where the airplane stopped obeying. Then he made them look at the point slightly before that and wrote home beside it. You cannot make men safe in a dangerous job. You can give them a habit of staying just this side of a bad decision. On the deck, the landing signal officer learned to read the dive plan in a pilot's posture long before the airplane came into the groove. Men who had carried an extra 60 knots 2 minutes earlier tended to come in a little fast and a little proud. The LSO stood with paddles that might as well have been a priest's hands. He cued power, bled speed, and kept fury and physics in a marriage that produced tires and not fires. The deck gang turned arrivals into departures in a choreography that looked like a fight if you didn't know the steps. Hook up, chocks in, spray bar cooling brakes, fuel fire hoses crouched like snakes ready to strike, wingtip walkers singing a chant only they could hear. The Hellcat's trick wasn't grace, it was forgiveness. It let a pilot try again, even when he deserved a lecture. When the fleet moved west, the air changed color. The Formosa air battles sized up the new rules. Japanese pilots were brave in that nauseous way courage looks when it has outlived its army's fuel receipts. Some were good. Too many were boys, with a few hours in a cockpit and a heart big enough to write their families' names on. They tried new geometries because war teaches math in blood. Zero stopped offering bellies and started trying to make the Hellcat pay for a shallow pullout. The answer to that was not a new trick, but fidelity to the old one. Stay steep a heartbeat longer, pull clean, resist the urge to jink, and climb. A lieutenant who had never been certain of anything in his life beyond the contents of his locker said in a debrief, "It feels like cheating." The skipper said, "Then keep doing it." On Laty's Edge, the dive plan met chaos. The air above Task Force 38 went from organized to biblical and back to organized so many times in a day that men forgot which meal their body was supposed to want. CAP sections went out and came back with strangers' eyes. Mason led a two-plane element that got vectored through a mess and came out with one kill and a wing with a crease in it that did not appear in any allowable manual. He walked the wing with a plane captain and both men stared at the wrinkle like it could answer for itself. The captain said the word maybe 3 times in 3 different tones and then banged the rib with his knuckles and said, "Yes." Yes meant the airplane would fly another cycle and enhance their odds and offend the gods, and the captain would not sleep right until he knew it had come back. The gods shrugged. Back in the CIC, the petty officer with the cigarette watched blips that were not blips but men, and spoke into a microphone like a man who had learned to pray. "Come left 20, hold, commit." The word commit meant the dive plan again. It was a surprising word to use in a steel box that smelled of coffee and pencil shavings, but it fit. The war's new religion was not courage, it was synchronized decision. Between cycles, the ready room turned into a classroom. The gunnery officer threaded film through a projector with the tenderness of an uncle tying a tie. The screen filled with jittery black and white and then steadied into a sight picture. There were patterns in those frames. The pilots who killed tended to shoot less, not more. They tended to put the pipper not on a wingtip, but where the airplane would be terrible in a second. A prop arc, a cockpit, a root. The tracers etched a modest chalk line instead of a glowing boast. The room learned, and the room lied less to itself. Mason said little because the men who say little and come back are allowed silence like a medal. Grumman, back on Long Island, earned its nickname again. The ironworks sent crates that fit into other crates and parts that fit into airframes that were both simple and subtle. An access panel opened to reveal 3 service points and not 1. A fitting matched a wrench a kid in a machine shop already owned. A line chief could teach a new man the Hellcat's insides without carrying a catechism in his head. The dive plan asked more of spars, and the factory responded by asking more of bolts. Replacement wings arrived as if air had made them. A Hellcat that bent wrong in the morning could be undressed and redressed in the afternoon and fly at dusk with a new wrist and a familiar soul. Industry became the partner the pilot had always suspected it might be. The enemy made a last ugly translation from doctrine to despair and began throwing airplanes at ships like stones at windows. The dive plan adapted grimly. You could not outturn a man who had decided to die in your bow wave. You could sometimes outpace him. The CAP took higher posts and longer runs. The slash became a fence instead of a knife. Pilots learned to fire at the airplane's future, ounces ahead of a cockpit full of resolve. It felt abominable, and it saved ships. Mason shot a kamikaze's wing off a quarter-mile from a deck he planned to land on later. He did not celebrate. He did not sleep well. He flew the next day anyway, because the calendar turned whether a man wanted it to or not. Somewhere in the Philippines, a young pilot dragged a Hellcat into a turn he had no business trying, and lived because the airplane had more room inside itself than he did. He came back and slumped against the ready room wall like a man who had just noticed gravity. Mason sat down beside him and told him a story about a morning above the marshals when he had decided not to believe a manual if it meant believing a 0 would be kind. He told him that every airplane contains a hidden number that is merciful and a hidden number that is final. And the trick of a career is to learn one without meeting the other. The kid nodded like a student nods when the test is in an hour and the teacher is also his only friend. They took Ulithi like a rumor takes a small town and turned it into an idea, a place you could pull the world into a circle and service it. The lagoon, filled with ships that looked like houses, turned on their sides. Air groups came and went with the sloppy grace of a bus timetable. Mechanics swapped parts across squadrons as if labels were a kind of sand that could be brushed off. The dive plan became a printed page in a binder on a desk in a trailer that had been a crate. But it stayed also what it had been. A choice a man made at 20,000 feet, with his hand on a stick, and his life between two numbers, he did not say out loud. In the spring, storms learned how to war. A typhoon walked across the fleet and taught pilots what real helplessness felt like. The dive plan was useless there. Men lashed airplanes to decks and prayed to gods they had not spoken to since the last time they thought they would not live. The fleet bled hardware into waves and swore at charts. Afterward, the same men who had shot down Zeros with composed cruelty filed reports about barometers and lashings. War is a sovereign that demands you be a farmer and a mathematician and a murderer and a carpenter in the same week. The Hellcat rode out the storm better than its pilots rode out their thoughts. The ironworks had built a tractor that could fly. When Okinawa rose on the horizon like a bruise, the dive plan showed old age and also a new kind of relevance. The cap had to be everywhere because danger decided to be everywhere. The slashing attacks turned into a kind of patrolling punctuation, hard commas in long sentences full of chaos. Mason flew too many hours that month and said too few words. He watched kids become men not by choice but by acceleration. He turned the numbers in his head into the voices he used on the radio. Hold altitude, he said, and men held. Commit, he said, and they went steep as if gravity were policy. They came back enough times that the ship's baker started icing cakes in the shape of airplanes, a joke that tasted like forgiveness. In the last weeks, peace began to draft itself in pencil. The radio spoke in softer nouns. The ocean did not care. It stayed huge and indifferent and full of secrets. Mason flew CAP over a world that had started to imagine that men might stop shooting each other and shoot clay birds instead. He still kept his pencil mark on the panel because habits become relics without asking permission. He made one last dive in anger on a day when a speck on the horizon refused to be kind, and the old geometry worked one last time and the airplane sang its tearing song, and then it was done. He went home to a country that could afford the luxury of forgetting its best lessons. He put his uniform in a cedar chest, because the smell of the wood could drown the smell of the ocean if you let it. He learned to sleep with a roof that did not move, and a bed that did not tilt. He married a woman with patient eyes, and told her stories the way a man tells fishing lies. The facts exactly true, and the sizes adjusted for comfort. He taught his son to drive with hands light on the wheel and said, "Don't brake in the turn, because physics is a tyrant on land too." He walked into a museum, once decades later, and put his palm on a Hellcat's wing root, and felt a ghost of a vibration and thought, "You carried me because 1,000 people I never met argued with metal until it became gentle." The dive plan that had been reckless became standard, and then simply became invisible, the way all good doctrine does when it stops being a choice and starts being a reflex. In training films, it looked clean and inevitable, a chalk line drawn with a ruler instead of with a man's pulse. In the memoirs of men who survived, it was a paragraph, then a phrase, then a breath between stories about mail and coffee and weather. On the engineering drawings, it was nothing at all, just a range of numbers margins knew they could trust. But if you pull on the thread of outcomes, fewer crashed Hellcats, fewer funerals, more strikes that arrived on time, because the CAP did not get dragged down into indecision. You find it winding back through a morning north of the Marshalls, when one pilot decided he would rather trust mass and altitude and a factory and 1,000 hands than the romance of a flat turn. There are footnotes that deserve to be epics, and epics that ought to be footnotes. This one is a footnote with a long shadow. It says that wars are won by the patience to turn a good intuition into a repeatable habit, and then into a laminated card. By the humility to let physics have the last word, and by the arrogance to believe your machine can do more than the manual says if you treat it with respect. It says that industry isn't a backdrop, it's a co-author. It says that an airplane can carry inside its ribbed skin not just fuel and bullets, but a promise. If you use me the way the numbers say you may, I will bring you home more often than I won't. If you want one more scene to hold in your head, make it this. A ready room, after the war, in a training squadron that will never see combat if humanity behaves. A young instructor draws a profile on a blackboard and says, "You will be tempted to turn because turning feels like fighting." He points at the steep line. "This feels like leaving," he says, "but it is actually arriving." He doesn't say Mason's name because he doesn't know it. He doesn't mention Grumman because he assumes factories are weather, not characters. He does not talk about the smell of the sea ice or the taste of coffee when your mouth has burned on oxygen for 3 hours. He draws the curve, underlines the entry speed, and says the word commit. The class writes it down like a spelling word. Outside, on a ramp that smells like fuel and rain, airplanes wait to teach the same lesson again. Height into speed, speed into safety, safety into choice, choice into victory, and victory, if you are lucky, into home. The ocean in the museum photograph behind the Hellcat still looks flat and harmless. It is not. It remembers every airplane that tried to turn too long and every man who believed too hard in courage. It also remembers the mornings when altitude turned into a clean burst and a clean climb and a landing on a deck whose painted lines meant you get to try again. The unapproved dive plan that became the rule isn't on the placard under the wing. It's in the metal itself and in the way your palm can feel, through old paint, the echo of a decision. Don't meet the enemy where he's strongest. Choose the moment, drop the weight, pull when the math and the machine agree, then go home.